I was also, because of death threats, I had to leave Israel as well. Direct confrontation, I would say, with Israeli academia began to be active in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. I became quite critical about the state of Israel, about Zionism.
All right, so hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Book Cafe podcast. In today's episode, we will be discussing the book entitled The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Professor Dr. Ilan Pappé. And I'm extremely pleased to have him in today's episode to be my conversation partner. And we have a lot of material to cover, so let's just dive right into the book. Professor Pappe, welcome to the show. It's really great to
Indeed.
connect with you.
Nice to be on your show, Omar. Thank you.
Okay, so Professor, as the host of the show, I know exactly who you are, but for the sake of our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book yet and who may be discovering you as well for the very first time, do please take this opportunity to tell us just a little bit more about yourself, such as your cultural and ethnic background, as well as your academic background, and in fact, anything at all that you would like to share with us.
Okay, very well. I was born in Haifa, in Israel. I was interested in history from very early on, and I became a professional historian through in Israel and postgraduate studies in Oxford, in England. And in the 1980s, through the research I've done, and also through a better understanding of the situation in Israel and Palestine, I became quite critical about the state of Israel, about Zionism, began to be active in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. And this all led in 2006 to direct confrontation, I would say, with Israeli academia and establishment, which forced me to leave Israel and to move to England, where I established in the University of Exeter in the southwest of England, the Centre for Palestine Studies, which is a postgraduate program for Palestine Studies. And this is where I am academically today. And throughout the years, I've published quite a lot of books and articles, all dealing with the modern history of Palestine and other issues as well. And that's it, I think.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for that brief introduction. And you did mention that you were forced to leave Israel, but if memory serves me correct, you are in fact dialing in from Haifa at this particular point in time. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's true. I was forced to leave the Israeli academia. No, I was also, because of death threats, I had to leave Israel as well. But
Okay.
yeah, I'm now on the road between Israel, Palestine, and Britain. So sometimes I do the talks from Haifa. Sometimes I do them from Exeter. Yes, I wasn't expelled. I didn't lose my citizenship, so to speak.
Right.
But I lost the ability to work in Israeli academia. No, to be honest, I don't want to be part of that academia either. So it's a mutual agreement
Okay.
not to be that part of the agreement. But of course, I have many Palestinian friends in Israel, Palestine, and I don't want to lose them or leave them behind. So as much as I can, I try to be in both places.
Understood. And of course, we will come back to Haifa a little bit down the road in the episode, Professor. But
Yeah.
for right now, I would like to touch upon the title of the book itself, Professor. So, given that it's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, I think it's only fair that we start with the definition. And you did mention a couple of definitions in the book as to what the term ethnic cleansing means. So, would you like to start with that, Professor, and tell us a little bit more about
Yeah.
what exactly is meant by this term?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, like any term, there are legal definitions, scientific definitions, or more popular definitions. But if you take all these different definitions together, it's very clear that ethnic cleansing is an operation by one ethnic group against another ethnic group. And usually it occurs in a place or space where there are two ethnic groups and one tries to get rid of the other. And the ethnic cleansing operation is a mass expulsion and uprooting of the ethnic cleansing of the ethnic group, which is a victim of the ethnic cleansing, which means that people are being uprooted and expelled because of their identity, because of their ethnic identity. And in most cases, of course, people don't voluntarily are willing to be uprooted, and they resist. And when they resist, ethnic cleansing operations are also accompanied by massacres, unfortunately, and the killing of people. And therefore, under this definition, for me, it was very clear that the Jews in Palestine were an ethnic group of immigrants, settlers, but nonetheless a collective group with an identity that wanted the space, namely historical Palestine, to themselves. The problem was that there was a lot of indigenous native people, the ethnic people of Palestine, the Palestinians, and therefore they took a conscious decision to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians through a systematic plan and execution. And therefore, I think that if you compare what they did and the connection between ideology, the operations themselves, and the results, I think it fits most definitions that we have, whether scholarly, legal, or popular, of ethnic cleansing.
Correct, absolutely. So the book, in fact, is about the 1948 Nakba, Professor, as you rightly said in your definition as well. You look at it as an ethnic cleansing, and very early on, Professor, I'd like to also bring in another scholar who's also a new historian like yourself, and whom you have also name dropped a couple of times in the book. I am, of course, speaking about Professor Dr. Benny Morris, who seems to have a different take on the situation, and he says that there wasn't actually a conscious ethnic cleansing by the Israeli regime. Rather, it was in the fog of war that they just sort of left their homes because there was an impending war that was coming. So,
That's right.
exactly. So, would you like to enlighten us, Professor, as to why the both of you have come to such vastly different conclusions despite looking at the same set of data? Do please take us through that.
Yeah. Well, I think the main difference is that for some reason, Morris ignores the fact that before the war started, which is the 15th of May, 1948, already 250,000 Palestinians became refugees as a result of ethnic cleansing operation. Namely, Morris repeats the Israeli narrative that there was a war, and because of the war, there are refugees, which happens in wars, which is true. But this is not the case here. There was first an ethnic cleansing before the war. The war started when the Arab world, or the Arab governments, were forced actually by their public opinion to do something about the ongoing ethnic cleansing. And they started a war against the state of Israel because of the ethnic cleansing. And Israel used the war to continue the ethnic cleansing of those it didn't manage to expel before May 48. So I think that that's one of the differences, the way we understand the chronology of who were expelled first and who started the war and why they started the war. But there's another difference between us. Morris is what we used to call very positivist historian. If he doesn't find a smoking gun document, namely a clear, order to ethnic cleansing all the Palestinians, then there was no ethnic cleansing. This is like someone who tries to find an order, which one never find, of Hitler to genocide the Jews. There isn't such an order. But it was very clear that this is what Hitler wanted. How do we know that? We, as a historian, we conflate evidence, we use oral testimonies, documents, and we reconstruct a picture. And therefore, if you take the documents that you have, the oral history, the testimonies, it's very clear that already in the early 40s, even maybe before, the Zionist leadership understood that if it wants to create a democratic Jewish state in Palestine, given the demographic balance, it would have to get rid of the Palestinians by force. And the opportunity came in 1948.
Absolutely. And as you rightly said in the book, Professor, the ethnic cleansing, in fact, started at least 5 months before May 1948, which I think a lot of lay people may not even know about. But I was really
Exactly.
shocked to, learn about this from your book. And how would somebody like Professor Morris or people who say that it was just in the fog of war that this happened. What is their response to this particular fact that it actually did start 6 months before the Israeli
Yeah.
independence? So what is their reaction to this? If I could ask you that.
Maybe they would say that before what happened before the 15th May was already a war. That's one possibility that leads them to think that actually, but that's a very flimsy and weak argument because there was no war. Uh, I don't know. They need to live with that narrative, and they find it more comfortable to think that ethnic cleansing in this case was the result of the war. By the way, he changed his mind. He's not totally clear about it. He has a book in Hebrew, which is not published in English, which is called Correcting a Mistake, Tikkun Ta'ut, in which he says that he was wrong to think that there was no master planning for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And then he changed his mind again. And in his most recent book on 48, which is called 1948, he justifies the ethnic cleansing by saying that otherwise the Jews would be ethnically cleansed. So it's very difficult to know what is the bottom line with Morris when it comes to the planning. Nor is it that important to waste too much time on it, really.
For sure. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, Professor. And
Okay.
one of the statesmen on the Israeli side was, of course, David Ben-Gurion, who went on to become the first prime minister of Israel. And in my reading of the book, Professor, I have to say that he comes across as a person with ruthless conviction, if I could say so. How would you describe David Ben-Gurion? Would you say that, yes, he was that kind of person? He had strong conviction to get to materialize the state, and he was also ruthless in his execution of how he wanted the state to come into being. Do please share your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah, he was ruthless in every aspect of life. The way he did not allow any political rivals any power in either before the state or after the state. He was ruthless in the attitude towards the Jews who came from Arab countries, towards workers and trade unions. No, he was a ruthless person, and the same ruthlessness served him well when he put aside the moral qualms that some of his colleagues had about the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians by a Jewish state 3 years after the Holocaust. You needed, from the Israeli perspective, you needed someone like this with no moral inhibitions. In fact, there's a famous sentence that I'm not the only one who quotes it, but I quote it as well in the book, where he says, I don't see anything immoral in transferring people. And that's what he thought, and that's what he behaved. So yes, it's ruthlessness. But it's more than anything else. It's a very cool-headed kind of, not cool-headed, I say, maybe a pragmatic approach to the idea: how do you create a democratic state when you colonize someone else's land?
Right.
The only way to create a democratic state when you colonize someone else's land is to make sure that you are either the absolute majority or at least that you have the majority or the exclusive majority. And this was very much a motivating impulse in his case. This is, by the way, why he objected to the occupation of the West Bank in 67. He thought it was a mistake. He thought that Israel should have withdrawn from the West Bank after June 67, because he said, what's the point of expelling 1 million Palestinians in 1948 and then incorporating 1.5 million in those days?
Right.
There were only, of course, today there are many more. But in those days, he said, why do we incorporate a larger number of Palestinians than the ones we expelled? He couldn't understand the logic, but of course, those who came after him had a different approach to the whole question of ethnic cleansing and the Jewish state, and they believed that there were other means of oppressing the population apart from ethnic cleansing. And we know the results. As they say, the rest is history, because we know the history of the occupation since 67.
Indeed, indeed. And of course, 1967 is a completely different kettle of fish, but we will try and get to that as
Absolutely.
well, Professor. So, at this point in time, Professor, I would like to also ask that in the book, obviously, David Ben-Gurion being the Israeli statesman leader, with the clear vision for what he wants, it's very clear in the book. But on the Palestinian side, I have to confess that I wasn't completely clear as to who were the leaders that were driving the Palestinian cause. And I would like to also make mention of another book that I read recently by Professor Dr. Rashid Khalidi, The 100 Years War on Palestine. And of course, his forefathers were, would it be fair to say that his immediate ancestors were some of the leading leaders for the Palestinian cause at that particular time? So, your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, well, in many ways they were leaderless, to say the truth. There were some notables like the Khalidi and others who were trying to give some sort of guidance to the society, but they had no official standing, and they were very limited geographically to where they could play a role. We have to remember Britain there was a great revolt against the British between 1936 to 1939, and Britain killed or wounded or exiled most of the Palestinian military and political leaders. So the Palestinians reached 1948 without that leadership.
Mm-hmm.
There was some sort of a leadership from the outside, run by Haj Amin al-Husseini, and some of the notables, and that included Khalidi as well. But they were outside of Palestine. They did not have a lot of resources to organize the community, and they depended on the goodwill of the neighboring Arab countries, who were not always very cooperative, and they had their own ideas of how to liberate Palestine or what to do with Palestine. So, in many ways, the Israelis exploited a very good moment in history where the Palestinian leadership was weak and the political system was fragmented. We also have to remember this leadership believed, almost some of them believed to the last moment, that what happened in Iraq and Jordan and Syria and Egypt and Lebanon would happen in Palestine, namely when the mandate ends, you give the land to the people. So Iraqis get Iraq, the Egyptians get Egypt, and the Palestinians get Palestine. Almost to the last moment, they thought that even if the British didn't do that, at least the United Nations would recognize that the majority of the people are Palestinian. This is the homeland of the Palestinians, not of the Jewish settlers. And therefore, they were really surprised when the United Nations suggested the partition. But by that time, the Jewish leadership was far better organized. They had the military capacity, and the Arab world did not want as yet to interfere. They had a very small military force at their disposal inside Palestine, and therefore, it's not a miracle that the Israelis were able to, complete the first stage of the ethnic cleansing before May 1948 without much difficulties, because the balance of military power was such that it was unavoidable that if they decided to expel a village, unless the British would have interfered, and they decided not to interfere, there was no way that these villages could defend themselves.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the United Nations in your answer, Professor. So I think now is a good time to actually bring in the example of another partition. And as you know, that I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and we, of
Yeah,
course, experienced our own partition back in 1947. We were still a part of Pakistan.
that's right. That's
Absolutely,
right.
and exactly. And so, so I'd like to just make reference to other historical figures, Professor. So on the Indian side, you had Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, and on the Pakistani side, you had Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Yeah.
And in those discussions with Lord Mountbatten, both sides were given an opportunity to look at what the partition would look like before it came into fruition. But in the case of Israel and Palestine, it seems to me that that never actually took place. The Arabs were always marginalized and was always favoring one set of people as opposed to another. Have I got that right, Professor? Would that be
Yes, but I think there's a big
yeah.
difference between the partition of India. There might have been a disaster as well. I'm not an expert on Indian history, but it was at least a partition between indigenous people. Everybody lived in India. India was not partitioned between British settlers
Right.
and Indian, whether they were Muslims or Sikhs or Buddhists and so on.
Mhm.
it was suggested to petition, what people thought was a Muslim ethnic identity and a Hindu Muslim identity. And then maybe that was the big mistake or not. I'm not getting into it. We're talking about Palestine. In Palestine, the ideal partition was not a partition between the two native people or two groups of native people. It was a partition between the settlers and so that's the first thing to say because it's different. As a Palestinian said, it would be like suggesting to the Algerians that they would partition Algeria into two states, one state for the French settlers and one state for the Algerians. And that's why the Palestinians could not say that. But you're absolutely right, but with a little bit of fine-tuning here. The Palestinians boycotted the partition negotiations. But they did say, offer us something else. Okay, we understand there is more than 500,000 Jewish settlers in Palestine. We understand that. Okay, let's continue to negotiate. What would be the status of these settlers in an independent Palestinian state? And actually, it's very interesting. In the United Nations Commission, UNSCOP, that decided on partition, despite the fact that they knew that all the Palestinians rejected it, they also had a minority group within UNSCOP that included the Indian representative. In fact, the Indian representative was how interesting and how ironic in a way. It was the Indian representative who said that partition is the bane of humanity.
Right.
How interesting. He had a very strong speech against partition as a colonialist idea. And he advocated what probably was the right solution, one democratic state for all.
Right.
Interesting that this was not what was happening in India, but anyway, for Palestine, he did wish one democratic state. I don't know, maybe he was against, I didn't look too deeply into this person. He's an interesting guy. Maybe he was also against partition in India. We have to see. But in any case, what is important is that the Palestinian rejection was not taken as a factor, which is very bizarre. They were the majority, 2/3 of the population, and the fact that they didn't agree to the petition didn't bother the United Nations. Said, exactly. Okay, they don't agree, but this is the solution.
Correct.
And then everybody was surprised that they were fighting against the solution. I mean, this is really, I don't think there are many cases like this in history, I must say.
Yeah. Indeed, Professor. And of course, you're absolutely right that it's not completely analogous because India was exploited economically, but obviously Palestine was a settler colonial project. And which
exactly.
brings, absolutely.
It's
so
two different paradigms,
two different paradigms, yes. So which brings me to your other book as well, Professor, which I'd like to very quickly touch upon. You, of course, wrote this book on Palestine with Professor Dr. Noam Chomsky, and we're also very huge fans of him on the show. And it was edited by Frank Barat. So firstly, what was it like working with both Frank and Professor Chomsky? If you could just very quickly tell us that.
Yeah, it was very, very fruitful. And Frank is an old friend. I knew him for many years, so working with him was easy. Working with Chomsky is a bit more difficult. He's a very methodic person with not much free time on at his disposal, but we had some very good conversations, and when we found out that actually they could be translated into a dialogue in a book, I was greatly honored by the fact that it was the second book that he already authored with me. It's a great privilege to learn so much from his knowledge, his experience, his amazing ability to analyze some differences of opinion, which we expressed in a very friendly and nice way. I support the one-state solution. Chomsky supports the two-state solution. I support the full implementation of the Palestinian refugee right of return. He's more skeptical about this. I supported the boycott, divestment, and sanction. He in particularly doesn't like the idea of academic boycott. He's against it. So we have our differences. We also share a lot of things. So I thought it was very interesting. For me, it was important because some Palestinians were angry with Chomsky about the position I just mentioned, as you know.
Mhm.
But I thought they should remember how much he devoted in the struggle for justice in Palestine. And I thought that was another way of saying that, yes, we may have some difference of opinion with him today, but we should never forget, we should not forget, uh, the longevity of his support and commitment to peace and for justice in Palestine. And so there was a very intriguing and fruitful dialogue.
Absolutely. And you, in fact, preempted my next question, Professor, which was actually about the one state and the two-state solution. And of course,
Mhm.
both yourself and Gideon Levy, we were very blessed to have had him on the show as well a couple of episodes back, and he fully supports the one-state solution, just like you do. But
That's
if I
right.
were exactly, but if I were to ask you this question, Professor, hypothetically speaking, even if there was a once democratic state for everybody, we know that the end game for the Israeli regime is to have as many Jews as possible with as little Arabs as possible. Are you ever fearful that even if you do have one democratic state, the Israeli regime may still try to expel the Arab population just like they did back in 1948? Are you ever fearful of this? So,
No, no, it's the other way around. If there is a one-state solution, there's no Israeli regime.
okay.
No, you don't have both. You can't have both.
Mhm.
What you have first is the end of Israel, as we know it, and this will be replaced by a democratic state. So it's not Israel anymore.
Okay.
So there's no Israeli regime. You have a different kind of democratic institutions that reflect the demography, that reflect the history, that rectify the evils of the past, that relate to the problem of the refugees, change the relationship between the Jews in historical Palestine and the Jewish communities in the world. And therefore, you build a different kind of a political system. And therefore, this danger does not exist.
Right.
The only danger that exists is that if such an outfit is not going to be built, and people will continue to talk about the two-state solution, you will continue to have the one-state solution that exists today. And this is the one in which Israel continues the ethnic cleansing.
Mhm.
So we have to understand the difference between the models here.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a utopian model because,
Yeah.
of course, Israel, as we know it today, would not agree to that model. But apartheid South Africa also did not agree to a non-apartheid regime, and it did happen eventually. So we have to be hopeful, but
Right.
not to be deterred by the fact that Israel doesn't want the democratic regime. That doesn't mean that we should not strive for it and work for it as much as we can.
Right. And you've preempted my next question, Professor, which was actually how far away are we from that vision of that one democratic state, given that the US is fully backing Israel at this point in time. But I also know that you've said many times that, history can change in the blink of an eye and things can, become very topsy-turvy. So do you feel that within our lifetimes we will see this one democratic state come into fruition, and that the U.S. will not be giving a carte blanche to Israel in the next
Yeah.
couple of years?
Yeah, I think what is safe to say is that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Zionist project in Palestine. But we know historically that an end can be a long period.
Mhm.
It can be 10, 20, 30 years before the processes that are imploding from within Israel and will eventually bring down the Zionist regime can continue for decades, or 2 decades at least, before this happens. And this is, of course, a very dangerous time because the more they would feel that they're losing the grip, the more ruthless they would be in their reaction. But there are very clear indication that this is the end of the project. There is a lack of social cohesion inside the Jewish society, which cannot be overcome even with the sense of false unity that now exists in Israel because of the 7th of October attack by the Hamas. There is a growing isolation of Israel in the global civil society that eventually will influence even the American government. It will take time, but it will influence even the Americans, as happened in South Africa. There is there are developments under the surface in the Arab world that have not yet matured of democratization, that will also lead to a different stance by the Arab regimes against Israel. So there are so many indicators that it would be very difficult to sustain a state only on the basis of constant war and violence and bloodshed. Not many people of its own state would like to stay in such a place, and they would have to reconcile with the fact that this is not working. I'm
Understood.
not saying that people would be happy about it, and I'm not saying that many Jews will stay. We're saying maybe those who can leave would leave, but I think it's not sustainable for the long future. But it can, as I said, it's a long process. We have to be ready for that.
Indeed, indeed. And of course, Professor, you've gone on record as saying that you are an eternal optimist. So we will, of
That's
course,
right.
hope for those days to come.
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm sure it will happen. I hope sooner than later. That's my only thing. Yeah,
Indeed, indeed. Okay, so just a couple of questions with regards to Bangladesh, Professor. And obviously, as I mentioned, that I'm based in Dhaka, and
that's right.
I can remember that and I'll ask you a question which I actually asked Gideon Levy during his episode. And the question is that for the longest time on Bangladeshi passports, we had a disclaimer which said that this passport is valid for every country of the world except Israel. With full respect to our Palestinian audience, would you like to see Bangladesh and Israel establish diplomatic relations, or do you believe that the current climate does not warrant it, and that this is something that should be deferred until the far future, until we get a Palestine resolution for the people of Palestine? So what would be your
No,
thoughts?
no, I think that the Bangladeshi position should remain as it is. It's my advice. And I think it should also be part of a more, first of all, regional, then global, then pan-Islamic movement to make sure that this kind of example is followed also by countries in the global north, not just in the global south. The reason I'm saying it is because I'm afraid that if we are not able to change the reality through pressure, through sanction, then desperate people would try to change it by force, as we have seen on the 7th of October. Uh, I don't think that what happened after the 7th of October is a great recipe for the future. You know, if we see what Israel is doing in Palestine. So if there's and not visiting a country, sanctioning it is not a violent act. It's a peaceful act. It's a legal act. Actually, it's a much more hopeful uh, mode of action for changing reality than sending suicide bombers who are brave and so on, no doubt about it. And maybe some of them think that they have a better afterlife because of that. But it doesn't change the reality. It doesn't change the reality as such. So I think, yeah, I think that's what you have to make sure that you're not the only ones, because then you look a bit bizarre,
Mhm,
and then people would say, oh, it's hatred of Jews probably, or something like that,
mhm.
or it's Islamic culture. But if it's part of a global movement, it's very powerful.
Exactly, exactly. And in fact, I will just say one more point before moving on to the next question, Professor, since
Yeah.
we're coming to the end of our episode. I actually have in my hand another book entitled Surrender at Dhaka. And this was written by a man named Lieutenant General J.F.R. Jacobs. So I'll just very quickly tell you a little bit about who he was. He was a Baghdadi Jew, but he was also an Indian citizen, and he was also
Mhm.
Bengali by culture because he grew up in West Bengal, which is one of the states of India that has cultural ties with Bangladesh. And General Jacob is actually a war hero. He was the man who actually negotiated on behalf of the Indo-Bangladesh forces with the Pakistani occupying forces. And it was him alone, with his supreme negotiation skills, that actually was the prime reason for the liberation of Bangladesh from a military perspective. So
Mhm.
I would
Mhm.
definitely, because we're a podcast about books,
Absolutely.
I would
Absolutely.
definitely say that we're
Worth
extreme
reading, no doubt.
worth reading, and he was in fact honored as well by the government of Israel in 2019.
Mhm.
I can't seem to remember what it was, but I think there was a mountain, or there was a some uh, Okay, so there was a location within Israel
Some
that is
sort of
dedicated
gesture.
to, yes, to war heroes. So General Jacob is there as well. Okay,
Good to
so
know. Yeah, I'll look it up
for
for
sure.
sure. Thank you.
No,
Yeah,
no problem. Okay, so Professor, as I said that we're pretty much coming to the end of our episode, but just before I let you go, we have a couple of staple questions on the show because we are, after all, a podcast about books. So with your permission, I would like to
of
ask you
course.
some of those staple questions. But before I get to
Of
the
course.
staple, yes, but before I get to those staple questions, I have one surprise guest question for you. And the question is
Okay.
actually from Frank Barat, the editor of the book
Uh-huh.
on Palestine, whom you know very well. And let me just,
Okay.
yes, let me just very quickly give you Frank's question. So Frank Barat asks, Dear Ilan, is this the beginning of the end for Israel? So I think you already alluded to it a little bit in your previous
I
answer,
already
Professor,
answered.
but if you'd
I
like
said
to,
it is, and I try to give the indication. So, so I think yes, yes. As I said, it is, and there are indicators of the domestic implosion from within, the public opinion from the outside, changes in the Arab world. I should add to this also a new generation of Palestinians, young Palestinians, who I believe would also reshape the Palestinian liberation movement and make it a more cohesive and consensual group that has a clearer vision for the future. And I think this will also have a huge impact on the ground. Yeah.
okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for the added answer to what you had previously said, Professor. So just three questions, the staple ones.
Okay.
So the first staple question that we have, Professor, is that, and it's related to books. So if you could select a book that you feel that every young person should read at least once in their lifetime, it may or may not be related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It may or may not be a history book at all. But if you could select a book which is both edifying and useful, what would be that one particular
Mhm.
book?
The one book. Yeah, of course, it's always very difficult because there isn't such a book. There's a library that people should read. But if I had to, then I think Orientalism by Edward Said is a book that people cannot end their life without reading it. They should read it. There are many others, believe me, that are as important. But if I have to think about one, then I think Orientalism by Edward Said is the
Okay.
one.
Okay, Oriental. So I'm very glad to have had that book
Yeah,
with
we have it
me
there.
right
Okay,
here.
great.
Okay. Okay. So the second question, Professor, are you more of a fiction person or a non-fiction person? What genre of books do you prefer reading?
Oh, I'm very kind of balanced in this. So I have an equal reading of an equal number of books at my bed, which are fiction and non-fiction, and I try to alternate. I think it's very healthy to alternate. Once you finish a good non-fiction book, it's good to go to a fiction book. So I like them both. I think are in many ways narratives about humanity, different methods, of course, different freedom of imagination, and so on. But I like them both, and I think everybody should mix as much as they can.
Mhm. Okay.
Never be one genre.
Right. That's wonderful, Professor. So I think you're the first guest we've had on the show who has given a balanced response to this, say 50% fiction and
Okay.
nonfiction. So I really thank
Okay.
you for that. And finally, Professor, the last question for today. If anybody wanted to improve their knowledge of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which of your books would you recommend? If you could pick your top five books that people should read in sequence to be up to speed on Israel and Palestine.
Right. A good beginning, I think, is my short book, The 10 Myths of Israel. People can get hold of this, and if not, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. But I think both of them go together. I would rather people would read them both to begin with, and then there are others, of course, I would like people to read. But I think these two books are a good introduction, uh, both to people who've never been introduced to the subject before. And it's also very good two books for those who already have a basic knowledge, but may want to know more and go deeper into the history.
Okay, wonderful. So the 10 myths about Israel and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And of course, I really thank you for that. Okay, so let me just conclude by saying that for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon and put a like on this video. It really helps to spread the message that Dr. Pappe had, about his books as well as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and to get it to as many people as possible. The episode will also be available on Apple, Google, and Spotify, so please be sure to download it as well. The book, once again, is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Professor Dr. Ilan Pappé. Professor, my thanks to you as well. You've been a wonderful guest. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I've learned so much from your books, so this really means a lot to me and to our audience in Bangladesh. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much.